I never imagined that 20 years of marriage could end with a single sentence, spoken calmly across a polished table, as if he were discussing weather, not erasing a life we built together. When my husband told me he wanted a divorce, he didn't cry, didn't hesitate, didn't even look ashamed. He said he had fallen in love with someone else, younger, brighter, more exciting, and that this was simply the next chapter of his life. I sat there listening, nodding like a stranger, while something inside me quietly broke. If you think this story is only about betrayal, stay with me, because what followed turned that calm announcement into the beginning of his complete collapse. For 2 decades, I believed I knew the man I married. We started with nothing but shared dreams and long nights of planning a future that felt solid and honest. I supported him when his ideas were rough and untested, when investors laughed him out of rooms, when money was tight and doubt filled our home. I worked, sacrificed, and stayed invisible when his ambition needed all the spotlight. Together, we raised children, hosted dinners, built routines, and told ourselves that loyalty was the quiet glue holding everything together. As his career grew, so did his confidence. He became someone people listened to, admired, and feared disappointing. Our home filled with expensive furniture and louder silences. He traveled more, smiled less, and spoke in numbers instead of feelings. I told myself this was normal, the price of success. I ignored the late nights, the guarded phone calls, the way his eyes no longer searched for mine in crowded rooms. Loving him meant trusting him, or so I thought. The day he asked for the divorce, he framed it as mercy. He said I deserved someone who could give me attention, someone simpler, someone who would appreciate me. He spoke as if he were doing me a favor by leaving. Then he mentioned her, a woman he met through business, someone who understood his world, his pressure, his genius. He said she made him feel alive again. I remember how quiet the room felt after that, how final his words sounded. What he didn't know was how carefully I listened. Years of living beside a man who measured everything taught me to hear what wasn't being said. His tone was too relaxed, too rehearsed. He wasn't confessing love, he was closing a deal. I realized then that this divorce wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. He had already planned his exit, his image, his protection, and I was expected to disappear gracefully. In the weeks that followed, he moved quickly. Lawyers replaced conversations. Accounts were reorganized. Assets were discussed like chess pieces. He assured me everything was legal, clean, and fair. I signed papers with shaking hands, trusting the man I spent half my life with. I told myself I wanted peace, not war. I wanted closure, not answers. But peace built on ignorance is fragile, and mine didn't last. Small inconsistencies began to surface. Numbers that didn't align. Companies I didn't recognize. Transfers explained too smoothly. When I asked questions, he dismissed them gently, telling me I was tired, emotional, overwhelmed. He said business was complicated and that I wouldn't understand the details anyway. That sentence stayed with me, burning quietly. I had spent years understanding far more than he ever gave me credit for. The woman he left me for appeared publicly soon after. She stood beside him at events, confident, polished, playing the role I once filled. Watching them together hurt, but it also clarified something important. She knew nothing about the foundation beneath their luxury. She saw the surface, the success, the man he wanted the world to believe he was. I wondered what she would think if she saw what I was beginning to see. One evening, alone with documents I almost ignored, I noticed a pattern that made my stomach tighten, a sequence of transactions looping through accounts, companies feeding each other without producing anything real. It felt familiar in a disturbing way. I remembered stories he once told, laughing about how systems could be gamed if you were smart enough. At the time, I thought it was arrogance. Now, it felt like confession. I started paying attention quietly. No accusations, no confrontations, just observation. Each detail led to another and another until the picture forming was impossible to deny. My husband wasn't just successful, he was reckless. The empire he flaunted was built on deception, layered so deeply that even those closest to him couldn't see it. And the timing of the divorce suddenly made sense. He didn't leave me for love. He left to protect himself. He needed distance, clean separation, someone else to stand beside him when the structure began to shake. The realization was chilling. I wasn't discarded because I was unwanted. I was removed because I was dangerous to his secrets. As that truth settled in, I understood something else even more unsettling. If I stayed silent now, I wouldn't just be protecting him. I would be protecting a lie large enough to destroy countless lives. And just as I reached that realization, an unexpected message arrived that confirmed my fears and set everything into motion because someone else had started asking the same questions I had. That message did not accuse or warn, but it carried weight I could feel instantly. It came from a professional contact, cautious, indirect, asking whether I had ever noticed irregularities, inconsistencies, or things that felt intentionally hidden. Reading it, I realized my private doubts were no longer private at all. Someone else had seen the cracks, followed the trails, and reached the same conclusion without my help. In that moment, I knew the story was bigger than my marriage, bigger than betrayal. It was about exposure, timing, and consequences. And before I could decide how to respond, events began unfolding faster than I imagined. That very night, I replied to the message the next morning, choosing my words with care, because I understood that once I answered honestly, there would be no stepping back. I wrote that I had noticed things that did not make sense, that I was no longer connected to the business directly, but that my instincts told me something was wrong. The response came quickly, thanking me, asking if I would be willing to speak further. My hands trembled as I read it, not from fear alone, but from the realization that the quiet life I hoped for after the divorce was slipping away. Over the following days, I learned how investigations truly begin, not with sirens or headlines, but with quiet questions, careful listening, and patience. I was asked about timelines, about conversations, about moments I once brushed aside. I remember dinners where my husband spoke vaguely about profits, the way he avoided specifics when I pressed, the jokes he made about regulators being slow and clueless. Each memory, harmless on its own, now felt heavy when placed beside the others. What surprised me most was how calm I felt while talking. I had expected panic or guilt, but instead, I felt grounded. This was not betrayal. This was truth. And the truth had been waiting a long time to be acknowledged. The investigators did not promise outcomes. They did not offer reassurance. They simply listened, taking notes, asking follow-up questions that revealed how deep their concerns already were. Meanwhile, my husband continued living as if nothing had changed. He traveled, attended events, and posted carefully curated images that suggested stability and success. His new partner smiled beside him, confident and unaware. Watching from a distance, I understood how powerful appearances can be and how dangerous they become when people stop questioning them. He had built his life on the assumption that no one would look too closely, but someone was looking now, more than one someone. I began receiving updates, not details, but indications that my observations matched patterns they were already tracking. Shell companies, inflated valuations, circular transactions designed to impress investors without creating value. Each revelation tightened the knot in my chest. I thought of the people who trusted him, who believed in the image he sold. I wondered how many lives would be affected when the truth surfaced. At the same time, my personal life felt strangely quiet. The chaos I expected never arrived. Instead, there was space to think, to reflect, to process the end of a marriage that now felt like a carefully staged illusion. I mourned what I thought I had, even as I accepted what it truly was. Love built on deception is not love. It is performance. Then, without warning, the tone shifted. The questions became more pointed. Requests were made for documents I no longer had access to. I explained what I could, clarified what I could not. I sensed urgency growing on the other end of those conversations. Something had accelerated. Pieces were moving faster than planned. My husband noticed the change before I expected him to. He called one evening, his voice unusually cautious. He asked how I was doing, whether I was adjusting well. The concern felt rehearsed. When I kept my answers brief, he asked if anyone had contacted me recently. That question confirmed everything. He knew, or at least he suspected. The confidence I once knew was gone, replaced by something tighter, more controlled. I told him nothing. Silence this time was intentional. After the call ended, I sat in the dark, understanding that the balance had shifted. He was no longer ahead of the story, he was reacting to it. And reactions, especially rushed ones, lead to mistakes. Those mistakes came sooner than I expected. Financial news outlets began publishing cautious pieces, not accusatory, but questioning. Analysts raised concerns about numbers that did not add up. Investors hesitated. The market noticed. His company's stock wavered, then dipped. Publicly, he dismissed it as volatility. Privately, he scrambled. The woman he left me for began disappearing from his side. Photos stopped. Appearances became solo. I wondered when she realized the ground beneath her was unstable. I wondered what he told her and what he chose to hide. Lies grow heavier as they multiply. One night I received confirmation that formal action was imminent. I was advised to prepare for attention, to remain factual, to protect myself. Reading that message, I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Dread for the storm ahead. Relief that the truth would no longer be trapped in whispers. As dawn approached, I realized something important. The divorce that once felt like rejection was, in fact, a shield. He pushed me away to keep me from seeing the collapse coming. What he did not anticipate was that distance would give me clarity, and clarity would give the truth room to surface. And just as the first official notice was issued, setting everything into irreversible motion, my husband made a decision that would accelerate his downfall even faster, unaware that every move was now being watched. The notice went out quietly, without spectacle, but its impact was immediate. Banks froze accounts under review. Partners asked questions they had avoided for years. Meetings were postponed, then canceled. My husband's name, once spoken with admiration, began to carry hesitation. I watched it unfold from a distance, stunned by how quickly confidence turns into doubt when truth approaches. This was not the dramatic collapse people imagine. It was slower, more painful, like watching a structure rot from the inside out. He called again, this time unable to hide the strain in his voice. The calm authority he once carried was gone. He spoke faster, repeated himself, tried to sound reassuring while fishing for information. He asked if I had spoken to anyone, hinted that people were overreacting, that rivals were GA. Louse. I listened quietly, recognizing the pattern. When control slips, manipulators reach for familiarity. I did not give him what he wanted. I told him I hoped everything worked out and ended the call. That simple boundary rattled him more than any accusation could have. Behind the scenes, the investigation deepened. I was asked to clarify timelines, to confirm conversations, to explain decisions I once trusted without question. I realized how many moments I had dismissed simply because questioning them felt inconvenient. Trust can make you blind. Distance restores sight. With each answer I gave, the picture sharpened. This was not a single bad decision or risky strategy. It was a system built to deceive, sustained by charm and intimidation. As pressure mounted, my husband made a mistake born of desperation. He moved money, not carefully, not subtly. He tried to protect assets, shifting them through channels already flagged. To him, it probably felt like survival. To those watching, it was confirmation. That single move accelerated everything. Investigators no longer debated possibility. They prepared for certainty. Public perception shifted rapidly. Articles grew bolder. Language sharpened. Questions turned into accusations framed as analysis. His company's valuation plummeted. Board members resigned. Longtime allies distanced themselves, releasing statements emphasizing transparency and surprise. I recognized the pattern well. The same people who once praised him now rushed to separate themselves from his shadow. The woman he left me for finally disappeared completely. No public support, no statements, just absence. I wondered how much she knew and when she learned it. I wondered if she felt betrayed the way I once did, or if she saw this coming and simply chose self-preservation. In the end, it did not matter. She was never the center of this story. She was a symptom. For the first time since the divorce, I felt something close to calm, not satisfaction, not revenge, clarity. The narrative I had been pushed out of was finally aligning with reality. I was no longer the discarded wife, dissected every move. Commentators debated how it went unnoticed for so long. The answer felt obvious to me. People see what they want to see when success dazzles them. Questions feel impolite when money flows. My husband went silent. No calls, no messages. His legal team spoke instead, issuing denials that grew weaker with each passing day. Evidence stacked up, timelines aligned. The story the world was consuming now bore little resemblance to the man I once shared a bed with. And yet, I recognized him in every calculated denial. Friends reached out cautiously, unsure how to speak to me now. Some apologized for not seeing sooner. Others asked how I was holding up. I told them the truth. I felt sad, relieved, exhausted, and strangely free. The end of my marriage had felt like erasure. This felt like restoration. As the case moved forward, I was advised to prepare for testimony, not immediately, but eventually. The thought unsettled me. Speaking publicly meant reopening wounds I had barely stitched closed, but it also meant ensuring the truth could not be rewritten. I weighed the cost carefully. In the midst of this, I realized something profound. His decision to leave me was not an act of courage or honesty. It was a calculation that failed. He believed distance would protect him. He believed I would remain silent. He underestimated the power of truth once it escapes private walls. And as the first court date was set, signaling that this story was far from over, I understood that the final collapse had not yet arrived. The structure had cracked, but the moment it would truly fall was still ahead. When the court date was announced publicly, the atmosphere around my life changed overnight. Strangers recognized my name, not because I sought attention, but because my past had become attached to a scandal too large to ignore. Reporters speculated about my role, my knowledge, my silence. They wanted a villain or a hero, a simple shape for a complicated story. I refused both. I was just someone who had lived beside a lie long enough to recognize its echoes. Legal preparations moved forward methodically. I was assigned counsel to guide me through what cooperation would look like, what questions to expect, what boundaries to hold. I learned how carefully words must be chosen when truth enters formal spaces. Every memory, every conversation, every document had weight now. Nothing was casual anymore. I revisited years of my life not as a wife, but as a witness. What unsettled me most was how ordinary the warning signs seemed in retrospect. The late-night calls, the sudden changes in plans, the impatience when I asked for clarity. At the time, I attributed it to stress, ambition, the burden of leadership. Now, each moment rearranged itself into a pattern I could not unsee. Deception rarely announces itself loudly. It hides behind normalcy. My husband's defense strategy became visible through the media. He framed himself as a visionary misunderstood by conservative systems, a risk taker punished for thinking too big. He implied that failures were market-driven, not intentional. Watching this narrative unfold was painful, not because it fooled me, but because I recognized how convincing it could be to those who wanted to believe it. Charisma is persuasive, especially when backed by wealth. Behind closed doors, however, the reality was unraveling. Former associates cooperated. Internal emails surfaced. Financial trails that once seemed too complex to follow now read like confessions. Each revelation tightened the case. Each denial weakened his position. I was briefed periodically enough to understand the direction without drowning in detail. Emotionally, I moved through unexpected phases. There was anger, sharp and sudden, at the years stolen from me. There was grief for the future I once imagined. There was guilt for not questioning sooner, even though I knew manipulation thrives on trust. Most surprising of all was the absence of longing. I did not miss him. I missed who I thought he was. Friends from my old life reached out tentatively. Some admitted they had always suspected something, but felt powerless to speak. Others confessed they had been intimidated by his confidence, his success. Their honesty brought relief, but also sadness. Silence had protected him for years. It had isolated many of us from one another. As testimony preparation began, I practiced recounting events without emotion, a skill that did not come naturally. The goal was clarity, not persuasion, facts, not feelings. Yet each practice session stirred memories I had buried deliberately. The night I signed documents without reading closely, the time he dismissed my concerns with laughter, the way he framed doubt as disloyalty. These memories were no longer personal failures. They were evidence. The day before my formal statement, I barely slept, not from fear of him, but from the weight of finality. Once spoken, the story could not be retracted or softened. It would exist independent of me. Interpreted by courts, media, strangers, I accepted that loss of control as the price of honesty. When I finally spoke, the room was quiet in a way that felt respectful rather than tense. Questions were direct. Answers followed. I did not embellish. I did not protect. I did not accuse beyond what I knew to be true. I spoke of patterns, behaviors, decisions. I spoke of trust and how it had been used. The process was exhausting but grounding. For the first time, my voice carried authority. Outside reactions were swift. Some praised my courage. Others questioned my timing. A few accused me of complicity by association. I expected all of it. Public narratives simplify because complexity is uncomfortable. I refused to engage. My role was not to satisfy opinion, but to contribute to truth. Meanwhile, the financial world reacted with brutal efficiency. Assets were seized, projects halted, partnerships dissolved. The empire he built shrank. NK rapidly exposed to the light it had avoided. Watching from a distance, I felt no triumph, only a sobering awareness of how fragile power truly is when it rests on deception. My husband attempted to contact me once more through intermediaries. The message was vague, framed as concern, regret, misunderstanding. I declined to respond. Some conversations lose their purpose once honesty enters the room. Silence this time was not fear. It was closure. As the trial date approached, I understood that this story was no longer just about a marriage or a scam. It was about accountability, about how easily charisma can override caution, about the cost of silence and the strength required to break it. I did not know how the case would end. Sentences and settlements were beyond my control. What I did know was that the final chapter would force truths into the open that could no longer be negotiated away. And when that moment arrived, it would not only change his life forever, it would redefine mine. The weeks leading up to the trial felt unreal, as if I were watching my own life from behind glass. Days passed filled with meetings, paperwork, and quiet preparation, yet time seemed stretched and distorted. Every headline, every rumor, every speculation reminded me that the private collapse of my marriage had transformed into a public reckoning far beyond anything I had imagined. Still, beneath the noise, something inside me steadied. I had already lost the illusion that mattered most. There was nothing left to protect except the truth. My days developed a rhythm. Early mornings were spent reviewing timelines and documents, not because I doubted my memory, but because repetition built confidence. Afternoons were quieter, reserved for reflection and rest. Evenings often brought waves of emotion I could not predict. Some nights I felt numb, others overwhelmed. I learned to let those feelings pass without judgment. Strength, I realized, was not the absence of pain, but the willingness to endure it without retreating into denial. The media attention intensified as the trial approached. Commentators dissected my husband's past statements, analyzing every gesture and word. Old interviews resurfaced, once praised, now scrutinized for hints of arrogance or evasion. Watching this shift was unsettling. It demonstrated how easily narratives flip when power erodes. The same confidence that once inspired admiration now appeared suspicious. Public opinion, I learned, is fluid, shaped by context more than consistency. People speculated about my motives endlessly. Some painted me as a wrong spouse seeking revenge. Others suggested I was a pawn, used by authorities to legitimize their case. A few even implied I had benefited too long from his success to claim innocence. I resisted the urge to defend myself. Explanation invites debate. Truth does not require permission to exist. Behind the scenes, the legal machinery moved with relentless precision. Motions were filed, evidence cataloged, witness lists finalized. Each step brought the reality closer. This was no longer abstract. Dates were set, rooms reserved, lives rearranged. I understood that once proceedings began, the outcome would unfold publicly, regardless of my readiness. Unexpectedly, letters began arriving from people I had never met. Some shared stories of their own betrayals, professional or personal. Others thanked me for speaking when silence would have been easier. A few expressed anger, accusing me of tearing down something they admired. I read them all, even the harsh ones. They reminded me that this story resonated beyond my experience. It touched fears people carried quietly about trust, power, and deception. On the eve of the trial, I revisited the moment my husband told me he wanted a divorce. At the time, I believed I was losing everything. Now I saw that moment differently. It was the first crack in a facade that could not withstand scrutiny. His choice to leave, to distance himself, to pursue another life was not courage. It was miscalculation. He believed separation would isolate risk. Instead, it freed the truth. The first day in court was overwhelming. The room buzzed with restrained anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers. Observers whispered. When my husband entered, I barely recognized him. The assured posture was gone, replaced by tension he could not mask. For a fleeting moment, our eyes met. There was no apology there, only calculation. That confirmed everything I needed to know. Testimony unfolded methodically. Experts explained complex financial structures in plain language. Patterns emerged clearly, supported by data rather than speculation. Each explanation chipped away at the narrative of accidental failure. This was not mismanagement, it was design. Listening, I felt a heavy sadness settle in, not surprise. Confirmation. When my turn to speak arrived, the room quieted. I stood, aware that my words would be weighed not only for content, but for credibility. I spoke steadily, focusing on facts rather than emotion. I described decisions, conversations, behaviors. I explained how trust had been established, then exploited. I did not dramatize. The truth was sufficient. Cross-examination tested my resolve. Questions attempted to provoke doubt, to frame my perspective as biased. I remained anchored to what I knew. I acknowledged uncertainty where it existed. I refused to speculate. Precision mattered more than persuasion. When it ended, I felt drained but intact. I had not been diminished by speaking. I had been strengthened. Outside the courtroom, reactions were immediate. Headlines framed my testimony as pivotal. Analysts debated its impact. My husband's legal team issued statements minimizing its significance. None of it mattered to me. The record now reflected reality. That was enough. As proceedings continued, it became clear that the case was stronger than even investigators anticipated. Additional evidence surfaced, corroborating earlier findings. Defense strategies shifted, then faltered. Negotiations were rumored. Settlement talks whispered. The inevitability of consequences loomed. In quiet moments, I contemplated what would come after. Life beyond courtrooms and headlines. I knew rebuilding would take time. Trust does not regenerate quickly. But I also knew something fundamental had changed. I was no longer defined by someone else's ambition or deception. I had reclaimed authorship of my own story. The trial was far from over, but one truth had already crystallized. The collapse of his billion-dollar scheme was not the end of something grand. It was the exposure of something hollow. And as that hollowness became undeniable, I understood that whatever judgment awaited him, I had already crossed the most important threshold. As the trial progressed, the atmosphere shifted from tension to inevitability. What once felt uncertain now moved with a steady, almost mechanical momentum. Each witness added another layer, not of drama, but of clarity. The picture forming was no longer fragmented. It was complete. I sat through hours of testimony, listening to professionals explain what my heart had already accepted. The man I married built his success on carefully engineered lies. What struck me most was how methodical everything had been. This was not recklessness or desperation. It was planning, years of preparation disguised as innovation. I learned details I had never known before, not because he hid them deliberately from me, but because he never thought I would understand or question them. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. Being underestimated by someone you trusted cuts deeply. During breaks, I observed him closely. His reactions were subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who did not know him well. A tightening of the jaw, a pause before answering. Small gestures that once meant nothing now spoke volumes. Confidence had been replaced by calculation, control by survival. He was no longer directing the narrative. He was responding to it. The courtroom became a place of strange contrasts. Technical language filled the air, yet the emotions beneath were raw. Numbers represented lives, jobs, futures. Each fraudulent transaction rippled outward, touching people who would never sit in that room. I felt a responsibility I had not anticipated. By speaking, I had become a conduit for accountability, not just for my own story, but for countless others affected by his choices. Outside, public opinion hardened. Sympathy waned. Skepticism gave way to anger. Investors spoke out. Former employees shared their experiences. A culture of fear and silence emerged from the shadows, revealing how deeply his influence had suppressed dissent. Listening to those stories, I recognized familiar patterns. The charm, the intimidation masked as leadership, the insistence on loyalty above integrity. At night, exhaustion settled into my bones. Sleep say. Me in fragments. Dreams replayed moments from our marriage, altered now by hindsight. Conversations I once cherished sounded hollow. Promises felt conditional. I woke often with a sense of grief, not for him, but for the version of myself who believed in something that never truly existed, yet with that grief came resolve. I had survived the worst betrayal already. Nothing unfolding now could undo the strength I had found in truth. Each day I returned to the courtroom, steady and prepared. I felt that strength solidify. I was no longer reacting. I was present. Midway through the proceedings, a turning point arrived. A key witness testified about internal warnings deliberately ignored, documents altered to suppress concern. This testimony connected threads that had previously seemed circumstantial. The room felt heavier afterward, as if everyone understood the significance of what had just been confirmed. Even the defense shifted tone, abandoning denial for mitigation. Negotiations intensified behind closed doors. I was informed discreetly that plea discussions were underway. The scale of exposure had grown too large to contain. His legal team sought to limit damage, to salvage what little leverage remained. I felt no satisfaction hearing this, only a quiet acknowledgement that the truth, once exposed, cannot be bargained away. The woman he left me for appeared once, briefly, seated at the back of the courtroom. She looked smaller than I remembered, uncertain, as though the gravity of the situation had finally reached her. Our eyes did not meet. There was nothing to say. She, too, had been sold a story that collapsed under scrutiny. In that moment, I felt no resentment, only distance. As days turned into weeks, I adjusted to a new normal. My life revolved around proceedings, preparation, and recovery. Friends offered support in simple ways. Meals, messages, quiet company. I learned to accept help without shame. Independence does not mean isolation. Healing, I discovered, requires community. When closing arguments approached, the mood was solemn. There were no grand speeches, no theatrics. Facts spoke louder than rhetoric. The narrative constructed by evidence was undeniable. This was not a misunderstood innovator. It was a calculated deception on a monumental scale. I reflected on how far I had come since the divorce. At the time, I believed I was losing my identity. Now I understood I had been reclaiming it. The collapse of his empire mirrored the collapse of the illusions I once held. Both were painful. Both were necessary. The verdict itself, though still pending, felt almost secondary. Whatever legal outcome awaited, the moral reckoning had already occurred. His reputation was irreparably damaged. His legacy rewritten. The power he wielded over my life was gone. As I left the courtroom one evening, the city felt different, familiar yet altered. I realized that the story people would remember was not just about a billion-dollar scam. It was about exposure, about how silence protects wrongdoing and truth dismantles it. I did not know what the final judgment would be, but I knew something essential had been restored. My voice, once dismissed, now carried weight. And as the case neared its conclusion, I understood that the most significant collapse had already happened long before any sentence was handed down. The final phase of the trial unfolded with a quiet intensity that felt heavier than all the chaos that came before it. There were no surprises left, no dramatic revelations waiting in reserve. Everything that could be exposed had already surfaced. What remained was acknowledgement, accountability, consequence. I sensed that everyone in that courtroom understood this was no longer about proving guilt, but about measuring the cost of what had been done. Closing statements carried a weight I could almost touch. Prosecutors spoke with restraint, letting the evidence speak for itself. They outlined the timeline one last time, connecting decisions to outcomes, intent to impact. The defense attempted to soften the narrative, framing my husband as a man who lost his way under pressure, a leader who made mistakes that spiraled. The argument fell flat. Mistakes do not require years of concealment. They do not demand silence enforced through fear. As the jury withdrew to deliberate, a strange stillness settled over the room. For the first time in months, nothing was happening. No testimony, no questions, no preparation, just waiting. I realized how much of my energy had been consumed by constant vigilance. In the absence of action, exhaustion washed over me fully. I stepped outside, breathing in air that felt lighter than it had in years. Those days of waiting forced me inward. I reflected not only on the trial, but on my life beyond it. For so long, my identity had been intertwined with his ambition, his success, his shadow. Even after the divorce, that connection lingered through headlines and speculation. Now, as judgment loomed, I sensed a separation finally taking hold. Whatever happened next would belong to him alone. When the verdict was announced, I felt neither shock nor triumph. The words landed as confirmation of what had been evident for weeks. Guilty on multiple counts. The room reacted in waves, murmurs, sharp breaths, restrained movements. I remained still, absorbing the moment without letting it define me. This was not my victory. It was the truth reaching its conclusion. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but the damage was already irreversible. His empire was gone, assets dismantled, reputation destroyed. The billion-dollar illusion had collapsed entirely, leaving behind a cautionary tale rather than a legacy. Watching him being escorted out, I felt an unexpected sense of finality. Not closure, completion. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Commentators debated how someone so celebrated could fall so far. Analysts dissected warning signs EY now claimed were obvious. Former allies issued statements emphasizing distance. The world moved on quickly, hungry for the next story. Scandals have short lifespans. Consequences, however, do not. In the days that followed, I withdrew intentionally. I declined interviews. I ignored invitations to speak. My story had already been told in the only place that mattered. I focused instead on rebuilding routines that had nothing to do with courtrooms or headlines. Morning walks, quiet meals, conversations that did not revolve around betrayal or loss. I noticed subtle changes in myself. My posture relaxed, my sleep deepened. Laughter returned in small, cautious moments. Healing did not arrive dramatically. It seeped in slowly, unnoticed at first, until one day I realized I was no longer bracing myself for impact. The constant tension had lifted. The woman he left me for faded entirely from public view. Rumors suggested she had left the city, distancing herself from the fallout. I did not follow her story. Our lives intersected briefly, bound by his deception, but they were never meant to remain connected. I wished her no harm, only clarity. Financially, I faced challenges of my own. Years spent supporting his ambitions had come at a cost. I had sacrificed opportunities, delayed dreams. Rebuilding meant starting from a place I had not anticipated at this stage of life. Yet there was freedom in that humility. Success earned honestly, no matter how modest, carried a satisfaction I had never known before. People often asked if I regretted anything. The question lingered awkwardly, as if regret were expected. I considered it carefully. I regretted the silence. I regretted trusting without question. But I did not regret speaking when it mattered. That choice reshaped everything. Over time, my story shifted in the public consciousness. It became less about the scandal and more about survival, about what happens when someone steps out of a shadow and into truth. Messages continued to arrive from strangers who saw their own lives reflected in mine. Their words reminded me that speaking up rarely affects only one person. As sentencing approached, I prepared myself emotionally, not for him, but for the final chapter of a story that had consumed so much of my life. Whatever punishment the court imposed could not undo the harm done, but it could mark an end. And endings, even painful ones, create space for beginnings. When the sentence was finally delivered, it was substantial. Years, not months. Accountability measured in time he could not reclaim. The courtroom absorbed the decision quietly. There were no gasps, no applause, just acceptance. Justice, when done properly, does not need spectacle. I left the building knowing I would never return for this case. The chapter was closed, the narrative complete. What remained was my life, unburdened by secrets that were never mine to carry. And as I stepped into the future, I understood something clearly at last. The collapse that defined this story was not his downfall alone. It was the end of my silence. And that, more than anything, was the beginning of my freedom. After the sentencing, life did not suddenly become peaceful, but it became quieter in a way that mattered. The noise that had surrounded me for years, the constant tension of living beside someone whose world was built on secrecy finally faded. I woke up one morning and realized I did not feel watched, measured, or managed. That absence felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into a room after a loud machine has been switched off. The silence was not empty. It was restorative. I began rebuilding deliberately, starting with the smallest choices. I chose how to spend my mornings without considering anyone else's schedule. I chose where to live, what to keep, what to discard. Objects that once symbolized success now felt heavy with memories I did not need to carry forward. I let them go. Simplicity became a form of relief. Each decision, no matter how small, reminded me that my life was mine again. People treated me differently now. Some approached with admiration, others with caution. A few avoided me altogether, uncomfortable with what my story represented. I learned not to take any of it personally. Their reactions reflected their own fears about proximity to power, to scandal, to truth. I did not owe anyone reassurance. My responsibility was to myself. Work became a grounding force. I returned to projects I had once postponed, pursuits I had sidelined to support a vision that was never shared honestly. Starting again required humility. I was no longer attached to prestige or rapid growth. I valued transparency, collaboration, and steady progress. The satisfaction I found there was deeper than any public recognition I had experienced before. Occasionally, I encountered people who knew my husband only through headlines. They asked careful questions, unsure how to navigate the subject. I answered briefly, without bitterness. I refused to let his actions define the tone of my future. The past was acknowledged, not relived. There were moments of grief that arrived unexpectedly, a song, a familiar place, a memory untainted by what came later. I allowed myself to feel those moments fully, without romanticizing them. Grief does not mean regret. It means something mattered once, even if it was not what we believed it to be. Accepting that nuance helped me move forward honestly. I also confronted my own silence with compassion rather than blame. I understood now how power dynamics distort perception, how love can dull skepticism, how survival sometimes masquerades as loyalty. I forgave myself for what I did not know then. That forgiveness was essential. Without it, freedom would have remained incomplete. Public interest in the case faded, as it always does. New stories replaced old ones. Attention shifted elsewhere. I welcomed that anonymity. Healing thrives away from scrutiny. I met ordinary pleasures without commentary or judgment. Grocery shopping, long walks, quiet conversations. These moments anchored me more than any grand reinvention could have. One afternoon, I received a letter forwarded from my attorney. It was from my former husband. Brief, carefully worded. It acknowledged the outcome without apology, framed events as tragic misunderstandings, expressed a vague hope that time would bring perspective. I read it once, then set it aside. There was nothing to respond to. Some conversations end not with resolution, but with acceptance of distance. I reflected often on the woman I had been 20 years earlier. Optimistic, trusting, willing to build a life alongside someone whose ambition seemed inspiring rather than dangerous. I did not judge her harshly. She made the best choices she could with the information she had. Growth does not invalidate the past. It contextualizes it. As months passed, opportunities emerged that I would not have considered before. Invitations to speak privately with groups navigating ethical leadership, requests for consultation on governance and transparency. I approached these cautiously, mindful not to turn my experience into a spectacle. When I did engage, I focused on systems rather than individuals, on prevention rather than blame. If my story could help others recognize warning signs sooner, it would serve a purpose beyond personal catharsis. Relationships in my life deepened without the constant undercurrent of secrecy. Connections felt more genuine. I learned to trust again, slowly, deliberately. Trust rebuilt on clarity rather than assumption proved stronger. I no longer confused intensity with intimacy or control with care. There were days I felt anger resurface, sharp and unexpected. I acknowledged it without indulging it. Anger is a signal, not a destination. It reminded me of boundaries learned the hard way. Those boundaries became guideposts rather than walls. Looking back, I recognized that the divorce I once viewed as devastation was the first honest event in years. It stripped away a lie that had been suffocating quietly. Everything that followed, painful as it was, flowed from that moment of rupture. Sometimes collapse is the only path to truth. I no longer measured my life against what was lost. I measured it by what was reclaimed: integrity, agency, peace. These were not dramatic victories, but they were enduring ones. The world often celebrates spectacle. I learned to value stability. As I settled into this new chapter, one truth remained clear. The scandal that once defined me was never truly about money or power. It was about silence and what happens when it finally breaks. I did not emerge unscathed, but I emerged whole. And in that wholeness, I found something I had not expected at all: gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced upon me. Because without that collapse, I might have lived my entire life inside a story that was never real. As the first full year after the trial passed, I noticed how time reshapes memory without erasing it. The sharp edges of those months softened, not because the events mattered less, but because they no longer controlled my present. I could recall details without feeling pulled back into them. That shift marked real healing. It meant the story had settled into its proper place. Behind me, instead of looming ahead, I began to understand how deeply silence had shaped my earlier life. It was not only the silence of secrets, but the silence of self-erasure. I had learned to pause before speaking, to adjust my tone, to soften questions so they would not sound threatening. Those habits lingered even after everything ended. Unlearning them required patience. I practiced speaking plainly even when it felt uncomfortable. Each honest sentence reclaimed a small piece of myself. Conversations with others changed too. I no longer felt the urge to manage impressions or protect reputations. When people asked about my past, I shared what felt appropriate without embellishment or defense. Some listened attentively, others grew uneasy. Both reactions were acceptable. I learned that truth does not need universal approval to remain valid. One unexpected outcome was how my perspective on success transformed. For years, I equated success with scale, visibility, and momentum. Bigger meant better, faster meant smarter. Watching an empire collapse under the weight of its own dishonesty forced me to reconsider that belief. Now I valued sustainability over spectacle. Progress that could withstand scrutiny mattered more than applause. I reconnected with parts of myself that had been neglected quietly. Creativity returned in small ways, writing for pleasure, reading without distraction, engaging in projects that had no strategic value, only personal meaning. These acts felt rebellious at first, as if I were wasting time. Then I realized how deeply productivity had been weaponized in my previous life. Rest itself became a declaration of autonomy. Occasionally, reminders of the past surfaced unexpectedly. A news article referencing the case, a documentary proposal declined politely, a casual comment from someone unaware of my connection. Each reminder tested whether the wound was still tender. Over time, I discovered it was not. Scar tissue had formed, strong and flexible. The past could be acknowledged without reopening. I also thought often about accountability, not just legal accountability, but moral accountability. The trial addressed crimes. It could not address character. That reckoning belonged to him alone. I released the burden of hoping he would understand the harm he caused. Understanding is not required for consequences to matter. Justice does not depend on remorse to function. My own accountability mattered more. I held myself responsible for the life I would build next. That meant choosing relationships rooted in respect, not intimidation. It meant ignoring instincts I once dismissed. It meant walking away sooner when something felt wrong. These lessons were hard-earned. I intended to use them. Community played a role I had not anticipated. People I barely knew offered support simply because they recognized something familiar in my story. Their kindness reminded me that while deception isolates, honesty connects. Shared vulnerability created bonds that ambition never could. I allowed those connections to grow organically, without expectation. As I settled into this quieter rhythm, I recognized a subtle confidence emerging, not the performative confidence I had witnessed for years, but a grounded one. It did not demand attention. It did not require validation. It came from alignment between values and actions. That alignment felt like integrity restored. I stopped thinking of the divorce as abandonment. It was separation from a lie. I stopped viewing the scandal as humiliation. It was exposure of truth. Language matters. The words we choose shape how experiences live inside us. Renaming those events gave me power over them. Sometimes people asked if I would ever love again. The question carried assumptions I no longer shared. Love was not a goal to chase or a remedy to seek. It was something that might grow naturally in an environment of honesty and mutual regard. I was open to it, but not dependent on it. Wholeness no longer required partnership. I also reflected on the role of fear in my past silence. Fear of conflict, fear of loss, fear of being wrong. Those fears had seemed protective once. Now they appeared limiting. Courage did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated through small acts of truth, repeated until they felt normal. The world continued moving, indifferent to personal transformations. Markets shifted, headlines changed, new scandals replaced old ones. That indifference was freeing. My life did not need to be exceptional to be meaningful. It needed to be authentic. Looking back, I saw how easily charisma can eclipse character, how systems reward confidence over conscience. I could not change that reality, but I could navigate it differently. I chose discernment over admiration, questions over assumptions, depth over display. As another year approached its end, I felt a quiet certainty settle in. The chapter defined by betrayal, collapse, and reckoning was complete. It would always be part of my history, but it would not dictate my future. I carried its lessons without carrying its weight. And in that balance, I found something rare, peace that did not depend on forgetting, but on understanding. Peace that came not from winning, but from standing firmly in truth. Long after the noise had faded, as the second year unfolded, I noticed how my relationship with the past continued to evolve. It no longer felt like something I needed to manage or explain. It simply existed, a chapter that informed my decisions without demanding constant attention. I could move through days without thinking about courtrooms or headlines, without anticipating questions or rehearsing answers. That freedom was subtle but profound. I began to understand resilience not as toughness, but as adaptability. I had adapted to loss, to scrutiny, to reinvention. Each adaptation had required letting go of something I once believed was essential: status, certainty, approval. In their absence, I discovered quieter strengths: patience, discernment, the ability to sit with ambiguity without rushing to resolve it. My work took on new meaning as well. I became more selective about commitments, choosing projects aligned with transparency and long-term impact. I asked harder questions at the beginning rather than smoothing over discomfort. Some opportunities dissolved under that scrutiny, others strengthened. Either outcome felt like success. Integrity filtered what belonged in my life. There were moments when the old reflexes resurfaced: a hesitation before voicing concern, a desire to keep peace at the expense of clarity. I learned to notice those impulses without obeying them. Awareness created choice. Choice created change. Over time, speaking plainly became less effortful. It felt natural, even necessary. I also revisited relationships from my earlier life with fresh eyes. Some could be repaired, grounded now in honesty rather than avoidance. Others could not. Distance, I realized, is not always a failure. Sometimes it is an acknowledgement that growth has carried people in different directions. Releasing those connections without resentment felt like progress. The absence of constant vigilance opened space for curiosity. I explored interests I had postponed indefinitely: classes taken without a strategic goal, travel planned without networking considerations, conversations enjoyed without calculating outcomes. These experiences reminded me that a life well lived does not require constant optimization. It requires presence. Occasionally, I encountered narratives about redemption, stories that framed downfall as a precursor to rebirth for those responsible. I listened with detachment. Redemption is not guaranteed by consequence alone. It requires accountability paired with humility. That journey was not mine to evaluate. My responsibility lay elsewhere. I became more attentive to how power operates quietly, how influence shapes behavior long before it becomes visible, how organizations reward compliance and punish dissent subtly. These insights informed how I engaged with systems going forward. I sought environments where questions were welcomed, not tolerated, where disagreement did not threaten belonging. Gratitude began to surface in unexpected ways. Gratitude for friends who stayed steady without demanding explanations. Gratitude for routines that grounded me when everything felt uncertain. Gratitude for my own capacity to endure without hardening. This gratitude did not negate pain, it contextualized it. I stopped measuring progress by milestones others could see. Instead, I noticed internal shifts, how quickly I recognized discomfort, how confidently I set boundaries, how easily I rested. These markers mattered more than external validation. They signaled alignment. There were still days when anger flared briefly, often triggered by casual comments that minimized the impact of deception or romanticized risk-taking without regard for consequence. I allowed that anger to pass through without anchoring to it. Anger taught me where my values lived. It did not need to lead me. I also noticed how storytelling itself changed for me. I no longer felt compelled to frame my experience dramatically. The truth did not need embellishment to carry weight. Simplicity honored reality more faithfully. When I spoke, I chose words carefully, not to persuade, but to reflect accurately. The world's appetite for scandal waned entirely. The case became a footnote, referenced occasionally in discussions about governance or ethics. That fading felt right. Lives are not meant to be consumed as cautionary entertainment indefinitely. The lesson endures, even when the story recedes. As I considered the future, I did so without urgency. There was no void to fill, no image to restore. I was building something quieter and more durable, a life that could withstand scrutiny because it welcomed it, a life that did not rely on secrecy to function. I recognized how much of my earlier identity had been constructed in reaction to someone else's ambition. Stripped of that, what remained felt authentic. Preferences clarified, values solidified, decisions simplified, complexity gave way to coherence. Looking back, I understood that the most difficult part of this journey had not been exposure or loss. It had been choosing truth when silence felt safer. That choice, repeated consistently, reshaped everything that followed. It was not a single moment of courage, but a sustained practice. As the years continued, I carried forward not the spectacle of collapse, but the quiet discipline of honesty. It informed how I worked, how I loved, how I lived. The billion-dollar scam had ended. The marriage had ended. But what emerged afterward was not absence. It was presence. And in that presence, I found a steady confidence that did not depend on what had fallen apart, but on what had been rebuilt deliberately day by day in the open. As the third year unfolded, I noticed how deeply the lessons of the past had settled into my daily decisions. They no longer arrived as reminders or warnings, but as instincts. I could sense misalignment early, often before words revealed it. That intuition had been dulled once by loyalty and fear. Now it felt sharpened by experience. I trusted it without hesitation. I became more intentional about how I spent my energy. Invitations were weighed carefully, not for prestige, but for alignment. I learned that saying no early is kinder than saying yes reluctantly. This shift simplified my life in ways I had not anticipated. Fewer commitments meant deeper engagement. Fewer distractions meant clearer priorities. My sense of self grew quieter, less performative. I no longer felt compelled to narrate my growth or justify my choices. Peace does not announce itself, it settles. I welcomed that stillness, recognizing it as a sign of internal coherence rather than stagnation. I reflected often on how easily systems normalize silence. How many people remain quiet not because they agree, but because dissent carries cost. I had lived inside that reality. Understanding it gave me empathy rather than judgment. When others hesitated to speak, I listened for what remained unsaid. I created space where I could, knowing that safety is a prerequisite for honesty. The concept of loyalty changed meaning for me. Loyalty was no longer obedience or endurance. It became integrity maintained under pressure. Loyalty to truth, to values, to self. This redefinition reshaped my relationships. Those grounded in mutual respect strengthened. Those dependent on compliance dissolved naturally. Occasionally, I encountered narratives that attempted to recast the past in more palatable terms. Stories that softened responsibility or reframed harm as innovation gone wrong. I resisted engaging. Revisionism thrives on repetition. Silence, in this case, preserved accuracy. The record spoke clearly enough. I found myself mentoring others informally, not as an authority, but as someone who had navigated complexity and emerged intact. Conversations focused on boundaries, on recognizing early warning signs, on trusting discomfort as information. These exchanges felt purposeful. They transformed pain into guidance without exploiting it. I also became more attuned to my own limits. Rest was no longer a reward earned after exhaustion. It was a requirement. I honored it deliberately. This shift improved not only my health, but my clarity. Fatigue blurs judgment. Rest restores it. I treated both as strategic, not indulgent. As time passed, memories of my former husband lost their emotional charge. He became a figure from a previous chapter defined more by consequence than connection. I did not follow news about him. I did not speculate about remorse or redemption. His path was no longer adjacent to mine. That separation felt complete. I noticed how my language changed when I spoke about the past. It became precise without being sharp. I could describe events without assigning myself a role that diminished my agency. I was not merely a victim. I was a participant who learned, adapted, and chose differently when it mattered. That distinction restored dignity. The future began to feel expansive rather than uncertain. Not because it promised grand outcomes, but because it was no longer constrained by secrecy. I could plan without contingency, imagine without calculation. Possibility returned in a grounded, realistic form. I revisited goals once postponed indefinitely. Some no longer resonated. Others returned with renewed clarity. I pursued them steadily without urgency. Progress felt sustainable when divorced from external validation. I measured success by alignment rather than acceleration. There were moments of reflection that surprised me. Gratitude for the clarity gained, even at great cost. Gratitude for resilience discovered only under pressure. Gratitude for the ability to rebuild without bitterness. These feelings did not negate the harm done. They acknowledged the growth that followed. I also recognized how narratives of strength often overlook vulnerability. My journey had required both: strength to speak, vulnerability to feel the consequences fully. Honoring both allowed me to remain open rather than guarded. Openness, I learned, is not naivete. It is courage refined by discernment. As I continued forward, I carried a quiet commitment to live visibly honestly, to ask questions early, to welcome scrutiny, to choose transparency even when it complicated things. These commitments shaped not only my work, but my sense of self. The collapse that once defined my story receded into context. It remained significant, but it no longer dominated the frame. Life expanded beyond it, rich with nuance and intention. I was not defined by what ended, but by what endured. Looking ahead, I felt no need to rewrite the past. It had taught me enough. My focus rested on maintaining the integrity I had reclaimed. That integrity was not dramatic. It was consistent. It showed up daily in choices both visible and private. And as I moved toward the final chapter of this long reckoning, I understood something essential. The true measure of recovery is not how loudly one survives, but how steadily one lives afterward. I was living steadily now, grounded in truth, no longer shaped by silence. As I look back now, I understand that the end of this story was never meant to feel dramatic. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense, no final scene that wrapped the pain into something neat and triumphant. Instead, there was a slow settling, like dust after a collapse, revealing what had always been underneath. The truth did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as acceptance. By the time the legal consequences were complete and the public interest fully faded, my life had already moved on in quiet ways. I had built routines that did not rely on distraction or urgency. I had learned how to sit with myself without rehearsing explanations or anticipating judgment. That, more than anything else, marked the end of the journey. I no longer needed the story to resolve. It already had. What remained was understanding. I understood how easily love can be confused with loyalty, how commitment can slide into self-erasure when power goes unquestioned. I understood that silence often feels safer than truth until the cost of silence becomes unbearable. Most importantly, I understood that speaking up does not guarantee relief, applause, or justice in the way people imagine. What it guarantees is alignment, and alignment changes everything. I no longer carried the need to prove anything about my past. The marriage, the divorce, the scandal, and the collapse all belong to history now. They informed me, but they did not define me. I was not the woman who had been left, nor the witness who helped expose a crime. I was simply someone who chose honesty when denial was no longer possible. There were still traces of grief, but they had transformed. Grief became a reminder of what I valued rather than what I lost. It pointed me toward the kind of life I wanted to protect going forward. A life where questions were welcomed, not feared. Where success did not depend on illusion. Where relationships rested on mutual respect rather than control. I noticed how my sense of time changed as well. The urgency that once governed my decisions disappeared. I no longer rushed toward outcomes or away from discomfort. I allowed things to unfold at their own pace. Patience, once learned through necessity, became a preference. It brought clarity where speed never could. The world continued as it always does, indifferent to personal reckonings. New scandals emerged. New figures rose and fell. The cycle repeated. Watching from the outside, I felt detached but not cynical. I understood now that systems reward appearance until appearance fails. That reality no longer tempted me. I had seen its cost too clearly. People occasionally asked what I would tell my younger self, the woman who entered that marriage believing in partnership and shared purpose. I never had a simple answer. I would not warn her away from love or ambition. I would tell her to trust her questions, to listen when something felt wrong, to remember that devotion should never require disappearance. Those lessons could only be learned through living, not instruction. I also thought about the idea of forgiveness, a concept people often misunderstand. Forgiveness did not mean excusing harm or minimizing impact. It meant releasing the expectation that the past could be different. It meant refusing to let resentment anchor me to a moment that had already passed. Forgiveness, in that sense, was not something I offered him. It was something I gave myself. The collapse of a billion-dollar scheme had once sounded extraordinary, almost unreal. From where I stood now, it felt inevitable. Deception, no matter how sophisticated, carries its own expiration. It demands constant maintenance, constant control. Truth requires far less effort. It endures quietly, waiting. I move forward with a renewed commitment to live transparently, not because it made life easier, but because it made life honest. I asked direct questions. I gave direct answers. I chose clarity over comfort, even when it complicated things. That commitment shaped every part of my life, from work to friendships to how I spoke to myself. In the end, the story people remember may foe, cuss on betrayal, scandal, and downfall. That is the version that captures attention. But the story I carry is different. It is about reclaiming voice, about choosing truth when silence feels safer, about discovering that identity survives even when everything familiar falls away. There was no single moment when I felt whole again, Wholeness arrived gradually, through consistency, through choices made daily, without audience or recognition, through living in a way that no longer required concealment. If there is a lesson embedded in all of this, it is not about revenge or vindication. It is about alignment. When actions and values finally meet, peace follows, even if circumstances remain imperfect. That peace is not loud. It does not demand acknowledgement. It simply exists. This story did not end with his collapse. It ended with my clarity, and that clarity, once gained, did not fade. It became the foundation of everything that came after. That is where this story truly concludes.